Okay, so last time we looked at the Gemara, mostly in the first parak and a little bit in the third parak, about this question of the order of the avodah. And I know I left some things hanging there, but on balance, I decided that what I would like to do is to continue. I do want to push through the Mishnayot as much as possible. And some of these larger questions, I left everybody with a question about the significance of the order of burning the Ketoret or lighting the menorah. What do we think, what do we think the significance of these things are? And those are things that I would like to get back to. But I think on the whole, one of the things that we find that's so interesting about the Avodah of Yom Kippurim is we're going to take avodot that we do every day. We're going to mix them with avodot that are special. So every day we bring a korban tamid, and on Yom Kippur, of course, we're going to bring korban musaf. But we also have to bring the par of the Kohanim and the par of the Am. We have to bring the Sir Azazel, the Sir Hatat, and also the use of the Ketoret in particular. We're going to do a special avodah with Ketoret that we only do on Yom Kippur. And why we do these things and how we do these things and how that compares to what we do every day, I think is all worth trying to understand on some level. And I think the best thing to do for us, as I say, is in the meantime, we're mainly going to be pushing through here to get first of all, like the wider picture. The only thing I want to point out at the outset, the got a bit, but the Mishnah later on at the end of the 5th chapter does talk about the order that you need to do the Avodah in Yom Kippurim. And it says, Kol Ma'aseh Yom Kippurim ha'amur al haseder. All of the actions that we do on Yom Kippur are said according to the order. Im hikdim ma'aseh l'chaveiro lo asa klum. So if you do one of the actions before the next one, in other words, if you do one out of order, then you didn't do anything. In other words, each avodah is contingent on the next avodah, right? Or in the prior avodah. You can't go on to the next one until you've done the one preceding. And they give an example. Dam hiktim dam hasair ledam hapar yachzor v'yazem midam hasair v'yachar dam hapar. Right. So if you took the blood from the Sa'ir Chatat, and you did the avodah of sprinkling it inside the Beit Hamikdash, inside of the Heichal, inside of the Kodesh HaKodeshim, then you have to, if you did that before the Dam HaPar, you have to go back and sprinkle the Dam HaSir again after you've done the Dam HaPar. And then it goes on. We're not learning this Mishnah right now, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but I do want to point out that the Mishnah emphasizes the importance of doing the avodah in particular order.
Just to clarify, I'm assuming that it is emphasizing that order for the Seder in general, for the daily Seder, and not specifically the Seder on Yom Kippur.
Well, actually, I was just going to say that the Mishnah here is talking specifically about the avodah of Yom Kippurim, and that's what it says, Kol Ma'aseh Yom Kippurim Amur al Seder. So it's that you absolutely need to do these things in order on Yom Kippur, and it doesn't necessarily address what you need, that you have to do everything in order on a regular daily basis. It also doesn't necessarily mean that the avodah that you do on Yom Kippurim that you would do every day also necessarily has to be done in order. But obviously, all of it has to be done in order. And then on Yom Kippur, if you did the avodah of Yom Kippur itself out of order, then you're not yotzei, lo asa klum. You didn't do anything. So, did you want to add on to that or ask a question?
I mean, I do see a problem where the blood is concerned, because if one has to go back and sprinkle the blood from the seir, I mean, the blood coagulates pretty quickly.
Yeah, so we'll learn about that. That anytime there's a chashash that the blood is going to coagulate, they have there's a kohen that sits and stirs it.
But even if it's already been sprinkled.
Well, possibly, but we'll see. We'll see. In other words, we'll leave that till we get to this Mishnah. If it would be that there's no more blood left, then presumably you would have to go back and do the shchita of the seir again.
So presumably they have an auxiliary goat.
Well, presumably. Anyway, it's okay. Let's go back though now to the Mishnah that we're on. So we're in the third chapter, and we'll just read over the Mishnah that we looked at last week. Torah shel shachar hayta kreva bein dad le'evarim. The Torah that was brought in the morning was brought between the blood, the sprinkling of the blood on the mizbeach, and bringing the limbs of the korban tamid onto the mizbeach. Shel bein ha'arbaim bein evarim and nesachim. And the Torah that was brought bein ha'arbaim, that was brought between the time that the evarim of the korban tamid shel bein ha'arbaim was put onto the mizbeach, and the nesachim, the libations that were done afterwards. Imaya kohen gadol zaken o istenis mechamin lo chamin umetilin letoch hatzonen kedei shetafug tzinatan. So if the kohen gadol was old or he was frail, then they would warm water for him, and they would throw it into the cold water of the mikvah in order to defray some of the coldness. And the Tosefta says a little differently, not that they had warmed water and threw in water, but that they had warmed up, they would warm up pieces of iron, like pieces of iron ore, and put them in the fire, and then they would take those and throw them into the mikvah. And the Gemara raises the question: isn't that mitzaref the iron, right? So siruf of the iron, meaning that it's like that's a stage in processing iron, right, or processing any kind of metal. It's
tempering they call it.
In this case, it would be tempering. Siruf can also cover other aspects, but thank you. In this case, it would be a tempering, and so it would strengthen it, and that should be asura and Shabbat. And so there's a little discussion in the Gemara about what exactly was happening. So according to one opinion, it wasn't enough to really bring it to tziruf. They would take it out of the fire and let it cool off a little bit so that it was not so hot that throwing into the water would actually affect it, and so forth. But it's an interesting thing that they would do that. It was they came up with a way of heating water on Shabbat that would still be okay. Um, okay, so at this point, where are we? We at the beginning of the chapter, not the very beginning of the chapter. We talked beginning in the Mishnah Gimel this idea that anybody who comes into the Beit HaMikdash first has to do Tevilah. They have to go to the mikvah, and then the Mishnah says in here on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol has to tavel 5 times, and he has to wash his hands and legs 10 times. And Kulan B'Kodesh Al Beit HaParva, all of the washing and tefillot were done on Beit HaParva, which was one of the mishkot in the Beit HaMikdash, except for the first one, right? Because first he had to tavel before he came into the Azara proper. So he taveled the Shar Hamayim, which was one of the gates on the south side of the Azara. Then he came in. They spread out a drape of fine linen between him and the nation, and here it says Pashat Yarad Taval Alav Nistapeg. He would undress. He would go down and tavel, and then he would get up and dry himself off. And the first thing they would do is bring him the Bigdei Zahav, that he would wear all year around. And then he would get dressed. They would dress him, and then he would wash his hands and his legs. So this is the avodah that he did. Then he would chef the korban tamid. He would be mikabel the dam. He'd go in to offer the ktoret shel shachar and lahativ et haneirot, lakriv et harosh ve'et ha'evarim ve'et hachavitim ve'et hayayin. So plain order that's done here is as it says. So and it says here, so kibelat adam in Mishnah Dalet it said kibelat adam uzrako. He captured the blood and then he sprinkled it onto the mizbeach, and then he brought the Ktoret, and then he did the Neirot, and then he brought the Evarim. So, okay. So the Ben Dam Evarim here, we talked about that last time. It's not all inclusive, and we see that already here. But the point is, now by the end of Mishnah Hey, he's done all of these basic avodot that are associated with the Korban Tamid. So after that, Haviyu LeBeit HaParva. They would bring him to the Beit HaParva Uva Kodesh Haita. It was in Kodesh. Parsu Sadin Shabut Beino Lebein Ha'am. They would again put up this curtain of fine linen between him and the nation, him and the people. And the people here, it's mostly the Kohanim who would be able to see him. Kidesh Yadav Raglav Pashat. So he would first wash his hands and legs, and then he would disrobe. And Rabbi Meir says the order was different. Pashat, he would disrobe. Kidesh Yadav Raglav, he would wash his hands and his legs. It's a fine difference. We're not going to get into it today. Yarad v'taval alav v'nistapeg. He went down, he taveled, and then he got up and he dried, like he did before. And now Heviel bigdei lavan. Now they bring him the bigdei lavan. They bring him the white clothing that is special for the avodah of Yom Kippurim. Lavash v'kidesh yadav raglav. So then he gets dressed and he washes his hands and legs, right? So when he takes off his clothes, he washes his hands and legs. And when he dresses, he washes his hands and legs. So every tevilah is going to generate 2 times of kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. Let's look at the Bartanura. Have you the Beta Parva? Beta Parva. Bartanura says Mechashet echad sheshmo Parva. B'na'av v'nikreit al shmo. There was a magician. There was a sorcerer whose name was Parva. That he built it. He built this place, and it was named for him. So I think we may have touched on this before, but I'll just show you what the Gemara says about this. Just a second. The Gemara here says, so this is the Gemara in Lamed Hey Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, "My parva." What's parva? What's this? What's the meaning of parva? Amar Rav Yosef, parva amgusha. Parva was a sorcerer. And Rashi says, "Mechashef echad b'na'ah shmo parva." Right. So you see, the Bartanura takes the language that he put in the Mishnah from this Rashi. So that's all the Gemara says about it, and so it's a bit mysterious. The Tosfos here brings from the Aruch, right? So the Sefer Aruch was written in the 10th century. If you're familiar, Aruch was the earliest dictionary of the Talmud. It was written by a fellow named Rabbi Natan, who was Italian, and so he's coming in the sort of the late Gaonic period, and it's a very good source for not just explanations of the Gemara, but also, not just explanations of words, but also he explains certain passages in the Gemara, and he also has, in many instances, a different girsa than we have in our Gemara. So here he quotes the Aruch. He says, "V'zeh l'shano yesh min hachachamim shomrim ki chafar mechila tachat hakarka bekodesh ad sheyireh avodat kohen gadol." So what was the thing about Parva? Well, like why do we remember him? And why did he build this place? So they say that actually what he did is that he dug a tunnel under the ground in the Kodesh, so that he wanted to tunnels to get underneath the Kodesh HaKodeshim, so that he could peek inside and see the Kohen Gadol doing Avodah on Yom Kippurim. Yergishu HaKohanim b'chafira, but the Kohanim detected his digging, mitzauhu, and they found him. The Karaota Lishka al Shema, and they called that the Lishka, I guess, the part that he had started to dig out, which they, I guess, then made into a Lishka. They named it after him. This is still a very mysterious story, right? Because on the one hand, we could understand somebody being very curious about what the Kohen Gadol did in the Beit HaMikdash, but it's not something that I would think that we would want to necessarily remember somebody for. Like, why should we name a Lishka of the Beit HaMikdash after this, sorcerer who's, trying to literally undermine the Avodah? So I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. If I find out anything more about it, I'll tell you. But that's the story that the Aruch brings down.
I mean, I'm wondering if that maybe makes the Tevila a kind of mida connected mida connected mida. That in some sense
way?
this, in some sense, there's some kind of, I mean, the greatest hazard. I mean, the Kohen Gadol needs to be engaged in a kind of complete bitul. Like it's dangerous. Actually, it's dangerous to enter the Kodesh and Kodeshim for egotistical reasons or for the wrong reasons or the wrong way, even if one is the Kohen Gadol. And so, in some sense, one is literally immersing in sort of in sort of a pool name for the quintessential person who tried to go in for the wrong reason, the wrong way. And in some sense, yeah, maybe this is far-fetched. I guess this is far-fetched, but it's
well. I think what you're saying strengthens my question, which is this person who wants to enter the Kodesh HaKodeshim, for let's we don't know his intentions, but not for the right reasons, because no one's allowed to go in there except the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim. So all the more so, like in a sense, he's the very opposite of what the Kohen Gadol should be on Yom Kippurim, as you're pointing out. And so all the more so, why do we name the Lishka after him? Okay, let's go on. Let's see the Bartanura here. Let's continue.
I mean, just to, I mean, so I want to push this point really quickly. I'm remembering the Rashi on the different stages of the Israelites' journey. I guess this is in Maseh, in which he says the name of each place commemorates a particular hate, a particular downfall of Bnei Yisrael. Mm-hmm. And so there's something in a name that actually is commemorating something that we need to either some mida that we need to combat, or some stage in our sort of your spiritual purification.
So what you'd argue is that just like the Torah points out different stages of the journey that Bnei Israel took in Egypt, and some of the names commemorate terrible things that happened, Averot and rebellion and whatnot. So the same thing here, that the Lishkat Parva is dafka named after the person who was bad, right? That we want to remember that bad things can happen and bad people could do bad things in the Beit HaMikdash, or something like that. Could be. Okay, have you the Beit Parva u'v'kodesh hayta? In other words, Beit Parva, unlike the mikveh next to Shar HaMayim, which was not in Kodesh, Beit Parva is in Kodesh. Shetvila shniya zu im kol shar tvilot, chutz min harishona, tunot makom kadosh. Because this second tefillah, with all of the rest of the tefillah, in other words, this one and the next three after this, all of them except for the first one have to be done in a place of kedusha, a place that's kadosh. Of course, outside of Shar HaMayim is also kadosh, but in other words, it needs the kedusha of the Azara. The Torah, as we saw in Achrayimot, goes out of its way to say that the tefillah has to be done b'makom kadosh, right? That's the pasuk Brachatze B'Sarah B'Mayim b'makom kadosh b'lavash b'gadav, and he puts on his clothing. V'yatsa v'yasa et olato et olat ha'am v'chiper ba'ado u'va'ad ha'am. And then he goes out to do his olah and the olah of the people, and that's how it gets kapara. And that's what we'll be coming up on now. Rabbi Meir says that the order was different, that he would first disrobe, and then he would wash his hands and legs. And Bartanura says, we don't hold like Rabbi Meir. Okay. So Yerad v'Taval Labanistapeng, and they would bring him the Bigdei Lavan. So what were the Bigdei Lavan? Ketonet, Michnasayim, Avnet, Umitznefet, Amurim, B'Parashat Acharei Mot. Right, so they would bring him his shirts, his pants, uh, the sash or the belt, and his hat that are mentioned in Parshat Acharei Mot. Shekol avodot pnimiyot hayu bahen. All of the avodot that were done inside were done with these clothes. The avodot chitzonot kegon tzimudin musafin hayu bevigdei zahav shehu mishamesh ben kol hashana kula. All of the outer avodot were done in the bigdei zahav that he uses all year. Ben kol chalifa b'chalifa tzun tefila shtei kiddushei yadayim v'yadayim min hakiyur. Each time he changed, as we mentioned, he has to tavel, and then he has to do kiddush yadayim reglayim both before he changes and after he changes. But that was done from the kiyor, and not, as you might have thought, that maybe that was also done on Beit Park. But no, he went to the kiyor to do that, the other the kiddush yadayim reglayim. So now yeah, yes.
So perhaps you remember a question long ago, a few months. What is about the white garments of the high priest? So is there a difference between the ordinary concerning the girdle, the apnate? So you know this machloket is entirely in white clothes, and not like the ordinary Kohen who represented in this girdle the colors of the high priest. So you know this difference in seeing. So is the Kohen Gadol under the level of the ordinary Kohen on Yom Kippur or on the same level? So that is an old question you remember. So I want to remind of us that there is a question from the past.
Okay, you know what? The connection isn't good, and I don't hear everything that you're saying. And I'm going to ask you to repeat the question.
The question is, what is about the white garments of the Kohen Gadol? Because I remember there is a little bit machloket. So, for example, Hirsch and other argues that the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is under the level of the ordinary Kohanim, because and only concerning related to the color of the girdle the cabinet. So we know that the Hedyodi, the Kohen Hedyoni, the ordinary Kohen, symbols in his girdle the colors of the Kohen Gadol, but only in this part of his garments. And the Kohen Gadol, we could argue that he is on the same level. So he had white clothes, garment, but the girdle is like identical with the girdle of the Kohanim, the ordinary Kohen. But another interpretation of, I forget the Gemara, is that he is entirely in white clothes. So he is, so to speak, under the level of the ordinary Kohen. So I want to remind you the question from a few months ago.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. I wrote that down, and I'll try to say something about it next week. Since and now it's a good time to bring it up, because actually now we are going to delve a little bit into the clothing, and it is appropriate here. I didn't prepare it specifically for this week, but yes, B'li Neder, we'll look at that specifically next week. Here the Mishnah goes into a little bit of discussion about the Bigdei Lavan, right? So it says, B'shachar yalovesh pilusin shel shnei masar mana. In the morning, he would wear this extra fine linen garment that cost 12,000 mana, and ben arbaim hindvin shel shmona meot zuz. He would wear Hindu or Indian an Indian garment that was worth 800 zuz. We'll just look quickly at the Bartanura boot, right? So Pilusin is boots dak v'yafeh haba me'eretz Ramses. This was an Egyptian-made garment. It was very fine and beautiful. And the reason it's called Pilusin is because that was a translation for Ramses in the Targum Yerushalmi. The Targum Yerushalmi, Ramses is translated as Pilusa, or not because it was the translation there, but that was the word that was used to refer to Ramses. So the name in Aramaic for Ramses was Pilusa. So these were Pilusim. And Ben Arbaim Hindvin or Hinduin Me'eretz Hodu. They came from India. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Chachamim Omrim B'shachar hayalo be'shal shmona asar maneh. In the morning, he would wear garments that cost 1,800. 1,800 zuz, 18 maneh. Uvein ha'arbaim shel shnei masar maneh. And then in the afternoon, he would wear the garments that were worth 12 maneh. Hakol shoshim maneh. Altogether equaling 30 maneh. Elu mishel tzibur. These were from the public. V'imratzah losif mosif mishelo. And if he wanted to add, he could add from his own. So what was from the public and what could he add?
I'm going to assume funds for the garments.
Okay, that's a very reasonable assumption.
Which, and when somebody says very reasonable, that usually means wrong.
No. That's a fair point. No, but we just said hakol shoshim maneh. It all equals 30 maneh. So the elu immediately, the first place to look to see what does these refer to would be to the line just before it, which says that these were 30 maneh. So then we could say, we're reading it like this. These 30 maneh came from the public. And what does it mean they came from the public?
The public ponied up.
So they came from public funds. In other words, they came from funds that would have been already, part of the budget of the Beit HaMikdash. The Imratzah Hosif Mosif Mishalo. And if he wanted to add, he could add from his own. So if who wanted to add?
Kohen Gadol.
So presumably the Kohen Gadol. If he wanted to add on to these funds, why would he want to add on to the funds?
He wanted something nicer.
Yeah, he wanted to get something nicer. 30 maneh wasn't enough for him. So he wanted to get something nicer. So a maneh is 100 zuz. 30 maneh is 3,000 zuz. I just want to put that into some kind of perspective. The ketubah of the Tula was 200 zuz. And I haven't looked at this in a long time, but there's a tshuva from Moshe Feinstein where he does the calculation of how much that would have been worth. It was 200 zuz was worth a lot. It was enough to support, would be enough to support someone for like a few years. So 30 maneh is a huge amount of money. This is a lot of money for for a linen garment. It's quite exceptional, quite exceptional. Let's just see Bartanur here, and then there's something else I want to say about it. Right. So one thing, actually, before we see the Bartanur, so just this something which we should point out is that whereas the garments that the Kohen Gadol wears all year round, there's one set of garments that he wears all year round. And here, for this one day, he gets two sets of garments. He's going to get two sets. He's going to get a set to wear in the morning and a set to wear later on in the day, which eventually we'll find out that's really just to do the last avodah. That's special to Yom Kippurim, which, if you remember, when we learned Achrei Mod, that was to the last thing he did in the Bigdei Lavan was to go into the Kodesh HaKodeshim and take the machteh out that he had brought in earlier with the Ktoret. That itself is considered to be an avodah, and he had to wear Bigdei Lavan for that. And he's going to wear these. So basically, the second set of clothing he's just going to wear once. I think it's quite outstanding. Bartanura says, "Ubein ha'arbaim b'gedolim shalovei shalotzat kafu mafteh." Right? Bartanura says that. That's the only thing he had to wear them for. Kol shoshim maneh. It all equaled 30 maneh. Lahafi hadar klalim hu d'tana. So we might ask the question, why do I need the Mishnah to do this simple calculation? If in the morning the morning ones cost 18 and the afternoon ones cost 12, do I really need the Mishnah to tell me that altogether it equals 30? I know that 18 plus 12 is 30. So the Gemara talks about this, and the Bartanura here just brings up the conclusion. So the reason they go back and they summarize, they put them together and to put in the Mishnah, to tell us that it's 30 altogether. To tell you she'im pichet lo tan shel shacharit v'riba lo tan she'arvit let lanba. That he means to say that the important thing is the sum total of how much was spent. The sum total has to equal 30. And if they spent less than 18 on the morning ones and more than 12 on the afternoon ones, then let lanba, ein lanuba. We have nothing against that. That's the way the Gemara understands that the Mishnah wants to tell us that it equals 30, just so that you know that the important thing, the bottom line, is that the two sets of clothing together have to altogether equal 30. He has to give that extra to hekdesh, because the money, the mishel tzibur, comes from hekdesh. It comes from money that was owned by the Beit HaMikdash, which was money that was contributed by the tzibur as a whole. And here also, he doesn't get to buy it himself. He has to give the money to Hekdesh, and then Hekdesh can buy the clothing. So if he wanted 40 maneh instead of 30 maneh, he could add an extra 10 maneh to the pot, and then the procurer for the Beit HaMikdash would have 40 to spare. There's some other questions here, which I think we'll leave for now, but the Mishnah doesn't tell us why he should have two sets of clothing. What we know from Achrei Mod is that he has to change his clothes. We understand this. It's darshaned out to some degree, but we do understand from the Parsha Achrei Mod that he has to change his clothes to do the avodah that's in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. It's not immediately obvious that he would need more than one set of clothing to do that. So Gemara also talks about this, but I think for right now we're going to go on. Okay, so now Balo Eitzel Paro. Now he comes to his par. So what's his par?
It's the for copra for himself and his family.
Right. It's the par that's mentioned. Let's just remind ourselves. The beginning of Achrei Mot. Right? So V'zot yavo Aaron el Kodesh b'far ben bakar el chatat v'ayu liola. So he has to come with par ben bakar v'chatat v'ayu liola. So when it says here in the Mishnah that he's going to come to his par, that's the par. Paro haya omeid bein ha'ulam v'lamizbeach. His par is standing between the ulam and the mizbeach. Excuse me. Sorry, I should have prepared this before, but just I think we've seen this picture many times before, but let's just look to remind us where this is happening. Okay, so here we have the overhead view of the Mizbeach, and this is the Ulam, and there's stairs. They have the stairs going right up to the Mizbeach. I don't think that was exactly how it was, but it's okay. There's an area which we've talked about before that's between the Mizbeach and the Ulam. And when we talk about, right, you remember this from other things in Tamid, we have this idea that there are gradations of, how close you get ultimately to the Kodesh HaKodashim. So let's say once you're in the Azara, the Azrat Kohanim, so that's one level of Kedusha. Then the next would be Bein Ulam Mizbeach. Then the next would really be in the Heichal, and then the next would be in the Kodesh HaKodashim. Oh, and Michael's telling me that I'm sporadically freezing. I'm sorry, if you miss something because I got cut off for too long, just tell me and I'll repeat it. I actually did listen from the last recording, and I understand what you guys can be hearing, that sometimes like a word will drop or a phrase will drop. If it's very bad, then let me know, and I apologize. Okay. So that's where his par is standing. It's between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. So his head is pointed southward, and his face is toward the west, which was like the way the Korban Tamid was also positioned. The Kohen is standing to the east, and his face is toward the west. He leans two of his hands on it, and he says vidui, right? He says a confessional. Ana Hashem, aviti, pashati, chatati lefenecha ani uveiti, Ana Hashem, kaperna rabonot v'psha'im v'lachata'im she'aviti v'shepashati v'shechatati lefenecha ani uveiti, ככתוב בתורת משה עבדך, כי ביום הזה יכפר עליכם וטהר אתכם כל חטאותיכם לפני השם תטהרו, והן עונין אחריו, ברוך שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד. Okay, so what does the Bartanur say? Ben olam yizbech kol tzvon ha'azara yakasher min hadin lahamadat hapar. The whole northern part of the Azara, in principle, min hadin, was kosher for the standing up of the par, right? For bringing the par for shvita. The kula lifnei Hashem, because all of it is lifnei Hashem. That area that's north of the Mizbech is considered to be lifnei Hashem. The real reason that they had the par standing there was because of this idea of the weakness of the Kohen Gadol. That is, we didn't want to make him work more than he had to. So that he wouldn't be heavily troubled by taking the kli that's going to capture the blood very far. So he slaughters him near to the place where he's going to need it for taking into the Beit HaMikdash itself. Roshol Darom, Ufanav L'Marav. So his head was pointed south, the head of the par is pointed south, and his face is to the west. Bedina Yashiyat Roshol Lehechal. His head should be pointing to the Hechal, Shu B'Ma'arav, Va'achorav L'Mizbeach. He should have altogether been positioned so that his length should be going from west to east, so that the front of his head is pointed to the west, and his hind would be pointed east. We saw this also with the Korban Tamid. It was the same idea. We're afraid lest the bullock defecates, and that would be untoward, would be a gnai to show the place of the defecation toward the Mizbeach. So therefore his head was pointed south and his tail, his hind, was pointed north. This is better. In the middle of his body would be then between the ulam and the altar. He came so his head would be turned so that it's facing west. The Kohen would stand to the east, and the back of the Kohen would be facing east. And this was the confessional. I would like to talk more about the confessional next week. I think for now, let's just read on. And what's the next thing that happens? Mishnah Tet. Ba'lo l'mizrach ha'azara. So then he came to the eastern side of the Azara. Litzvon ha'mizbech, to the north of Mizbech. Hasgan mimino, v'rosh beit av mismolo. So the vice, the vice Kohen, as it were, is on his right, and the head of that Beit Av of the Kohanim is on his left. V'sham shnei hasi'irim. And there are the two Seirim that we know that the Torah says, Echad l'chatat v'echad la'azazel. The Kalpi Haita Sham, Uba Shnei Goralot. A Kalpi was there, and it had two lots inside. Shalesh Garoa Hayu, Eshgaroa, you see, probably boxwood. Vasa'an Ben Gamla Shel Zahav, and this fellow Ben Gamla made a version of them out of gold. And then he was remembered, he was mentioned or remembered for praise for having done that. Then we're gonna digress on all the nice things that people did that they were remembered for shvach, and all the things that people were not remembered so for shvach. So it comes to the east of the Azara, the Bartanur says, Balon Mizrach Azara Shalo Hayim Machnisim Asirim Bein Ulam Bel Mizbeach. Because there we don't bring the sirim into the same place that we brought the par between the ulam and the mizbeach when we're going to put the lots on them. They would be out in the azara until they were shechted. The kalpi, pre-eitz chalul. Kalpi is a hollow wooden box, and the Garolot were Avesh Garoa, Usa, Laz, Min Eitz V'Chashuv. It's a certain type of wood. Wood, and apparently it was boxwood. Ben Gama, Yeshua ben Gama Kashnit Manal, Yot Kohen Gadol, Asan Shel Zahas. Yeshua ben Gama himself was one of the Kohanim Gedolim. So he had the Garolot made out of gold. You must kirino talishvach. Ben Katin, we're just going to push on tonight. Ben Katin asashnema sardad l'kiyor. Ben Katin made 12 taps for the kiyor, for the basin that held the water. Shelo hayulo elashnayim, because it only had 2, right? The Torah only mandated 2, and he added 10 and made it 12. And we saw that in Tamid, right? If you remember that the idea of adding the 12, actually the Bartanu will say it also, but the idea was we saw that in the first payis there are 13, or the second payis, so the first payis is for Shumat Hadesh, and the second payis, there are 13 Kohanim needed for the second payis. And so to make things go faster and to make it more mechubad, he made a cap for 12 of them and not for 13 of them. And if you don't remember why, we'll see in a second in the Bartanura. He also made a muchni for the kiyor, which we also talked about when we learned Tamid, and we saw different interpretations of what the muchni was. Show you memav misalim belina, right? So whatever it was, its purpose was to make it that the water that was in the kiyor would not become pasul by being left overnight, unattached from the ground. Either, in other words, either because it was unattached to the ground. So one idea is that the muchni, right, was a. Does anybody remember what the interpretations of muchni were before I go on?
If I recall, there was sort of a pulley system by which I can't remember if the cure was immersed in the muchni or vice versa. But in any event, so the water that was in the cure would actually merge with water that was in a vessel attached to the ground.
Actually, the idea of the muchni was that the kiyor held water, and the kiyor is a kli sharet, right? So it's a dedicated kli that's used for avodah in the Beit Mikdash, and if the water would stay in it overnight, then the water would become pasul. So in the idea that the muchni was a mechanism, it was some kind of, like you say, some kind of a pulley system, something that maybe they would wind it down, so then it would be sunk low enough into a pit in the ground that would connect to water that was in the ground. So that it maintained it maintained the same status as water being pulled straight from the ground in the morning. The Rambam held that the muchni was actually a separate kli that was put on top of the kiyor that wasn't a kli sharet. And the idea was that since it wasn't a kli sharet, if the water stayed in it overnight, then it didn't become pasul. And then in the morning, the muchni would be like the kli with along probably with some kind of a tap that when you would open the tap, then it would bring the water from the muchni into the kiyor. So very different explanations, but they both accomplish the same thing. So Ben Katin added the taps onto the kiyor, and he also made the muchni kiyor. Munbaz hamelech hayoseh kol yedot hakelim shel Yom Kippurim shel zahav. Munbaz, the king, made all of the handles for all of the kelim that were used on Yom Kippur out of gold. Heleni imo, his mother Heleni, astan mivreshet shel zahav al pitcho shel hechal. She made a mivreshet, kind of a I can't remember how to translate this, but the idea of the mivreshet is something that's reminiscent of like a candelabra. If it wasn't a candelabra, we'll talk about it. Bardenura says it was a candelabra, but the idea of it we'll talk about in a moment. On the opening of the hechal. She also made a tablet of gold that Parshat Sotah was written on it. Nikanor nasu nisim l'daltotav hayu mazkirin oto v'shavach. Nikanor, there were miracles that were done to his doors, and he is remembered for praise. So you may know some of these things. Some of them we talked about, some of them you might know, and some of them you don't know. Let's look at the Bartanur, and we'll talk about them one by one. So Ben Katin was also, right, Kohen Gadol Haya, Rasa Shnei Masar Dad L'Kiyor, Kedei Shehiyu Shnei Masar Kohanim Hazochim B'Pais Shel Tamid Shel Shachar Mekadshin B'Vat Achat, as we just said, so that the 12 Kohanim who won the second pais of the Tamid Shel Shachar, they could wash their hands and legs all at once. That we said earlier in the second parak, there were 13. Lo asadad the shochet. He didn't make a special tap for the slaughterer. Shashchita kshera bezar. He didn't need one because the shchita itself was kosher bizarre. Or not that he didn't need one, but he was. What does he mean? Lo asadad the shochet shashchita kshera bezar. Like what is? But the shochet still would have to have washed his hands and legs. So what difference does it make that the shechita could be done by a zar? Well, in other words, either the implication is that the shochet doesn't have to wash his hands and legs, right? In other words, because the shechita could be done by a zar, it doesn't require a special washing, the special ablutions that would be needed by a kohen to do other avodah. This particular avodah could be done by a non-kohen, so it doesn't require kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. Or it also could refer to the fact that in the instance when a zar, in other words, when a non-kohen would shecht, he wouldn't have been allowed to come up that far to the kiyor to wash his hands and legs. But it covers all of the people who had to wash their hands and legs on a normal basis. Muthni galgal shakol babor. So Bartanur took this perush, right? That it was a wheel that was used to lower the kiyor into a pit. Shehiyu meimav mechubarim babor, so that its waters, the waters of the kiyor, would be connected to the waters that were in the pit, v'lo yipasul belina, and therefore they wouldn't become pasul by being in the kior overnight. Nivreshet is a menorah. So what was the purpose of the nivreshet? What was the purpose of this menorah that Helenia Malka made? I think we learned this a long time ago when we were learning brachot. We actually looked at, when we were learning Zmanim of Kriyat Shema and Tfilah in the morning, right? We actually looked at a sugya here in the third parak of Yoma. So do you remember what the nivreshet was?
I remember something about the sun hitting it, and then they knew it was time.
Right. This was a way. It was a way of knowing when the sun was up, and that it would have been time to say Kriyat Shema. Right. So it would be. So the idea was there was a nivreshet that was on the opening the opening of the Heichal. So it means it's facing east, and it's raised. And when the light would hit it, then people would know. In other words, that meant the sun was up high enough that you could sing Shema. So that was its purpose. And what was the purpose of doing the Tavla of the Sotar? Sheparshat Sotar K'tuva aleh. V'lo yitztarech lavi Torah lichtov mimena Parshat Sotar. So they wouldn't have to bring an actual Sefer Torah to write from it Parshat Sotah. So what was that about? Why would they have to bring a Sefer Torah to write Parshat Sotah?
I mean, it actually write out the. I mean, I'm assuming that's the equivalent. That it's actually sacred writing, i.e., it has to be the exact. It has to be exact, not just the exact words, the exact letters. It's almost like an amulet. I mean, and then the letters are scraped off. So I'm assuming they have to get it exactly right.
Right. So put it a little bit differently.
You must write the oath from the Torah. So there's the oath for the sotar, so for this situation, and you must copy this oath on a parchment. And so not to avoid to bring out the Torah scrolls out of the Aron or something. So you do, it was engraved, the text, the literature, the text on this tablet. So you can you can copy the oath, the formulation, the exact wording of the oath written in the Torah from the table on this parchment. And so to perform the procedure, what's going on the sotar and other things, the wife must swear something.
Yeah, that right. So exactly. So the right. So when the sotar procedure would be done,
yeah.
So right, one of the integral parts of the procedure is that there's a shmuah that the kohen makes the sotar say, and that has to be written out, as you say, on parchment. And then, as you say, and as Michael mentioned, that that has to be erased, has to be erased with water. But the point is, and this is what's evidenced here. So that what the tabla of gold does, it accomplishes two things. It obviates the need to bring a Sefer Torah out, and it's not kavod for the Sefer Torah to be moved about. In other words, the Torah, when it's in an Aron, and this is true today, it's at least as true today, don't take the Sefer Torah out for no reason. We don't take it out of the Beit Knesset, even for a good reason, unless it's a very, very good reason, right? So we're not supposed to do that. So here, okay, writing, that's one thing. The other thing is, as you're both alluding to, there's a halacha. Torah should be chtav, eta rashai la'omro ba'al peh. This idea that Torah should be chtav, you're not allowed to say it by heart, also applies to writing. Whenever you're writing Torah Shabbat, you have to write from another written copy. You have to write it from a written copy. That's a halacha ad hayom hazeh. The only there is an exception for mezuzah and tefillin, because if the sofer is completely familiar with them, the shkurot befiv, then he's allowed to write those ba'al peh. And also later on in the Mishnah, later on in, I think it's in Perek Shvi'i, that we'll see there is an exception to reading the Torah not from the Sefer Torah. It actually happens on Yom Kippur in the Beit HaMikdash. We'll see later on that the Kohen Gadol, when he has to read the Maftir from Parshat Pinchas, he doesn't read it from the Sefer Torah in order not to trouble the tzibur. But the general rule is every time you're dealing with Torah Shabbat, you have to read it from Ktav, and certainly when you're writing it, you have to copy it from Ktav. So until Helenia Malka made her Tabla, they would have to bring out a Sefer Torah and write, and then the Kohen would write it down, as Michael alluded to. You have to write it. In other words, you have to write it properly. You have to write it essentially the same way you would write it in a Sefer Torah. But the important thing is that he wasn't allowed to write it from memory. He had to write it from another written copy. So this way, they didn't have to bring out a Sefer Torah, but he still had some written copy to write it from. So the writing, I'm just saying this is a sofer, there's an interesting aspect to this, that the writing on the tabla would be considered writing for this purpose. And the reason I mention that is because when we talk about writing a Sefer Torah, we have very specific definition. We have a specific definition, a specific set of definitions of what Ktav means when we're talking about a Sefer Torah. And you might have thought that Ktav per se is something that has to be on animal skin and written with dio, a sefer with dio. But here we see that's not true. And there's another raya that ktav, something can be considered ktav, even if it's written on, even if it's etched in gold, or cut, or the letters cut out from gold. What's the other example? Also in the Beit HaMikdash, where do we have ktav? Where do we have ktav that's actually made out of gold?
I mean, you have the, I mean, I forget what the article was called, but there's the piece that the Kohen Gadol wore across his forehead that said Kodesh Lashem.
Correct. That's the tzitz. That's the tzitz. And the Gemara itself, the Gemara in Gittin, learns out certain dinim of ktav from the way the tzitz was written, the way it was made. So anyway, this is all because I'm a sofer and I can't resist, but it is an interesting thing.
So I'm wondering, I'm thinking about sort of properties of gold. The gold, unlike other metals, and certainly metals that were available then, actually can be, made into leaf. It could actually be made thin enough that it actually acts like paper. And I'm wondering if, in fact, that's why it's sort of the equivalent of parchment.
Well, you can make silver leaf just like you can make gold leaf, and you could even make copper leaf like you can make gold.
You actually can't make them as thin as gold.
It's not, well, I'm not so sure about that, Michael, because I actually own silver leaf and I own gold.
Okay, I stand corrected.
The reason, I can just tell you, the reason silver leaf was not something that was commonly used is because it's going to tarnish, right? But gold leaf doesn't tarnish. So that's one of the reasons that it is true. It could be that on some molecular level, you're right. I'm really not a metallurgic expert. Gold has that property. Pure gold can be beaten very, very thin. But nonetheless, I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that in terms of ktav, it's sufficient, even if it wasn't written on parchment, if it was written faithfully, based on reading from a Sefer Torah, that it would also be considered ktav.
So would say the two stones that erected on, was it Mount Ebal? I forget the other mountain that we read about in Kitavo. Where they take two stones, cover, they take two stones and cover them with plaster and write across them. Would those have the status of ktav?
Yes, those were also good. And also the Luchot HaBrit had the status of ktav. We don't have to go further than that, right? We know that stones are, and we learn other things about the halacha of ktav from the stones, but it's nonetheless interesting, this whole idea of putting this on gold. So I think we can understand, right? So this addition of gold, we understand it's fancy. Everybody understands it's worth a lot of money, and so people who would donate gold in these regards were mentioned for Shabbat. And I would also, but I would point out what's interesting. Well, I'll ask you. So let's just go through the things that we mentioned so far. So we had the Goralot. There was a donation to make them out of gold, and Munbaz HaMelech made all of the Yadot HaKelim out of gold, and Heleni Amalka made the Nivreshet Shel Zahav and the Tavla Shel Zahav for Parshat Sotah. Would you see, I'm just looking at these things, and I'm also looking at what Ben Katin did. Ben Katin didn't donate gold, but he makes the kior, he expands the kior and he creates the muchni. He makes the muchni so that we don't have to fill up the kior with fresh water every day. So, would you see? I don't phrase this exactly. What do you think that, what do you think was maybe more praiseworthy? What would be the more praiseworthy things from your point of view?
I guess part of what strikes, they come immediately after the count of the Kohen Gadol, taking off his big day zahav and putting on his linen garments. So this, on the one hand, it's sort of, it is playing at the value of these things. On the other hand, it's also in the context of an avodah, where the zav, was permissible, even required, sort of in a certain space, but also mamash not permitted, beyond a certain line. So, at least there's a kind of back and forth between zahav and.
Well, I missed part of what you were saying because I think you were partially muted. But you know what? Say it again. I don't want to get. What were you saying? What are you trying?
I simply saying that the timing of the count of these donations is striking. That it comes immediately after, the count of the Kohen Gadol stripping off his big day zahav and putting on the linen garments. So you've got all this.
The timing. You mean the timing, the way it's brought in the Mishnah? Is that
exactly?
Okay. And what are you trying to? And what do you? So what's the implication?
I think it raises a question more than anything else. Why specifically here, and why is describing all these gold articles specifically at a moment where it talks about removing gold from the.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. But okay, so first of all, why were these brought here? Why does the Mishnah bring these here?
There is the discussion of value, and specifically the value of the linen garments, and who made donations for the linen garments.
You could say better. Why does the Mishnah here says, Kalpi hayta sham uvashne garot shel ashkaro hayu. Vasan ben gamma shel zahav. Vahiyu mazkirin oto l'sheva. So the point is, at this point in the order of what's going on, they're bringing the Kohen Gadol over to do the Kalpi, right? That's going to be the very beginning of the next chapter, in chapter 4, Taraf the Kalpi, that is going to go and reach his hands into the Kalpi. And they're saying that the original Kalpi, with the box was made of wood and the Gorolot were made of wood, and Ben Gamma made them out of gold. And since we meant, so that they're pointing out that that was a reality, that originally they were made from wood, and then there was the donation, Ben Gamma, to make them out of gold, and he was remembered for praise. And so now, Toch Kedei, since I mentioned him as donating something that did not have to be there, in other words, there's no din that said that the Gorolot have to be made out of gold. We understand the Minat din, they can be made out of wood. So the fact that he donated the ones made out of gold, we remember him for Sheva. So now that I mentioned that, now the Mishnah has this whole long Mishnah about other people who, in a similar vein, did similar types of donations. What was similar about their donations to Ben Gamla's donation of the Gorabot? How are their donations similar to? Yes.
Does the Mishnah mention that the whole Beit HaMikdash was rebuilt during the period of Herod? And so the new Beit HaMikdash was from, I guess that all the things were much more luxurious than they were in the old days with the preceding Beit HaMikdash. So why do they remember some, למה הם מזכירים פחיתים מסוימים ולא שכל בית המקדש עצמו נהיה הרבה יותר מפואר?
That's a really good question, which I haven't actually thought about in this context, right? The Beit HaMikdash that's described in Masechet Midot and essentially in the rest of the Mishnah is Mikdash Hordus. It was the Mikdash that was refurbished under Hordus. And I think I hadn't thought about this before, but yeah, the Mishnah doesn't point out that Hordus made this was a tremendous donation, right? He completely upgraded the Beit HaMikdash. So I don't know the answer to that. That's a really interesting question.
Of course, I mean, Hordus was to put matters mildly, Hordus was a problematic king.
No, I understand that. But I want to tell you something. Munbaz HaMelech was also problematic. This is what there's. It's not completely. In other words, perhaps the simple answer is that yes, that on the one hand the rabbis accepted the upgrade of the Beit HaMikdash from Hordus, but on the other hand, they didn't want to glorify him for time immemorial by mentioning him by name in that regard in the Mishnah. And that's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. But it's an interesting thing that Paul is raising. But to get back to what I was saying, here we have Ben Gamla, just a second. Here we have Ben Gamla, who donates the Goralot, and then I have all these other people who made various types of donations. So what is similar about their donations to Ben Gamla's donation? Why are they?
In some sense, there was the expression hidorlan the mitzvah. They beautify the mitzvah, but they're not required for the.
Right. Basically, in other words, in all of these cases, they're doing something that is not required, but nonetheless, or because of that, they're mentioned for Sheva. I think in the case of Ben Katin is a little bit out of the order here, in the sense that Ben Katin made these practical additions. Which was also a kind of a hidur, but it wasn't that he added more gold into the Beit HaMikdash. but that he actually thought that these things are going to help the avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. The other people are adding, with Munbaz HaMelech, he gives Yadota Kelim, right, out of gold. And the other, I think also the Huini, his mother, who made the Nivreshet and made the Tavla, I think in that sense are a little bit more like Ben Katin. That is, Munbaz's contribution doesn't make the avodah any easier. If anything, it might make it more difficult because gold is heavy, right? The more,
But gold is also imperishable.
and
It doesn't corrode. It actually, it doesn't.
no, I
corrode.
understand that, but what I understand that. In other words, that's that the basic idea that gold is that we would mention him for Shabbat. Oh, so wait, I'm trying to understand what you're adding. So I think what you're
basically what I'm suggesting is that is that on a certain level it is practical in the same way as Ben Katin's donation was. They're basically making these. They're basically taking that was made out of a perishable material, and basically making out
relatively
perishable.
Because they made the handles out of copper and silver, and some of them were already made out of gold, right? Those were all materials that were used. So it's not like they're going to perish over the next couple of years. They could last for centuries. But
actually, silver, if it's getting wet, actually tarnishes pretty quickly.
Yeah, I understand, but it doesn't break down. It's not like iron that's going to rust and then fall apart. It gets black. It'll turn black, but it still has its integrity. But I'm not. I understand what you're saying. So, but Bonagid, by making it gold, he's made it that much more permanent. Okay, I think it's an interesting point, and I very well could be right. The point is, the truth is, all the Mishnah lumps them all together because all of them did, as we said, as Michael said, these are all things that are done that were not necessary, but they helped either by making the mitzvah more beautiful or making it easier or making it more accessible. And all of those, for all those reasons, they're mentioned for Shabbat. Let's just finish off with Nikanor, and then next week we'll do the people who were Lignai, because now it's late. So Nikanor, Shem Adam. Nikanor was the name of a person. Nasuni Sim Adaltotav. So it's an interesting thing. So Nikanor, it's not that we attribute him to having purchased or donated the doors, but what happened? Shalach Alexandria, he went to Alexandria in Mitzrayim, Lavid Latot. So the doors for the Beit HaMikdash were going to be made for Sha'ar Nikanor, right? We call it Sha'ar Nikanor coming into the Azara. Those doors were made in Alexandria, and he goes to pick them up. And on the way back, a big storm brews up that's going to sink them all, right? So So he in order to help steady the ship, he threw one of the doors into the ocean or into the sea. And they wanted to throw the second one, and Nikanor said to them, not that he did. Apparently the sailors did, right? The sailors threw one of them in, and they wanted to throw the second one in. And he said to him, "Kitiluni ima, throw me into the sea with it." And as soon as he said that, miyad nachaya mizapo. So then after that, as soon as he volunteered to go in along with the second door, in other words, he was willing to die rather than let another door be for the Beit HaMikdash be lost to the sea. So that was one miracle. But kevan shegiu the namal shel Akko hayta mivatzbetzet v'yatza mitachat tafnei hasfina. The second miracle is when they docked in Akko, the first door floated up from underneath the ship. So he got both of them to the Beit HaMikdash. So we also remember him for Sheva. Okay, so next, since it's after 9, I want to stop now, but next week we'll do the next part of the Mishnah, or the next Mishnah. But just to remember, just so we keep our place here, so to keep our place, the Kohen, by the end of the chapter, has done the vidui on his par, and he's getting ready to put the gorolot onto the seirim. And all the rest of that was parenthetical. So I think that's where we'll stop. Any last comments or questions? Okay. Thank you all, and see you next week. And I'll try to address some of the things that people brought up. Thank you.
Good night, thank you.
Night.